Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 5/2 of 2015. We have about the best section of summary work by Ricoeur that we've seen thus far. It's just 20 pages, but it's a beautiful summation of what his position has been up till now. And it's going to break down as the narrative of the universality of selfhood, and then the implotment of praxis positing, and then the reflexive action of return in actuality. So he begins with the narrative of the universality of selfhood, that workspace of narrative that we hold. And he says that the agent self has many layers of identity. We have those traits of sameness that creates that trait sign model that defines the character of the self. That's formed out of our habits. And as we know, we have a motivational core, which he calls the motivational base of attestation. And that is linked up to our disposition. Now, the disposition is that correlate of psyche, which is related to that workspace of the universality of narrative. The universality of narrative always implicates a subject. There's always the implication and the interrogation of the subject, so there is going to be a correlating disposition, which is aligned with the universality of narrative and our motivational base. So disposition becomes kind of an entrance node into that motivational base of attestation. It becomes a type of a phronesis, which means it's the intentionality that we take to the dialogue threshold, and it is kind of that self-actualizing stance at the dialogue threshold. It's kind of our leaning in of our intention and our loyalty concerning our motivational base and our view of the universality of narrative concerning the self. And then finally, we do have the actual workspace of universality of narrative, and that's the third subject, which is a virtual posited consciousness between all of the selves that participate in discourse at the dialogue threshold. That's our universality of narrative as a reference point where we're all together trying to work out the universality of what is the meaning of humanity, what's the ideal, what's the ideal of our conceptualization of selfhood. We have that workspace of universality where everyone's particularity at the dialogue threshold can be gathered and refined, and we can work on this workspace of the universality of the narrative of selfhood. So we have a very layered type of identity concerning our character. We've got traits, we've got motivational core, we've got a disposition that kind of triggers the motivational core. We've got a phronesis of our intentional leaning in at the dialogue threshold. It's kind of the emotive force of entrance into dialogue. And then we have that workspace for universality that we always keep open toward revision. It never reaches finality ever. It's always open to revision. So the multi-layered self next goes out of the self and into the world of a finite history, in an attempt to try to posit a universality of history and to try to posit a universality of selfhood in order to raise reality to a greater depth of meaning. And that begins as implotment. And it's in the implotment of praxis positing. We will confer unity. We will confer a structure. That structure will be an eschatological vision toward the completeness which we enclose in our intentionality. It will be inclusive of a correlate positing about the subject, because we do believe that this universality does interrogate and implicate every subject also. Now, Ricoeur takes up the Greek concept of muthos as his category to define implotment. And it is the self taking up the ideal narrative of universality out of that workspace, and by reviewing it to actually devise and work up a true praxis positing of particularity. And so in order to do that, Ricoeur says that we actually employ a thinking disposition. So we take up that thinking disposition as a dianoia, and a dianoia means it's a thoughtful reflection on our own existential disposition and its existential importance. And we use that in conjunction with that universality of Selfhood workspace, and between the two of them, we put together a very individual praxis positing. So we end up with a 5-step process for this mythos of what Ricoeur calls implotment, plotting out our praxis positing. To plot out our praxis positing, we're going to be involved in referencing the workspace of the universality of narrative. We're going to be gathering information there. We're going to be gathering information out of finitude concerning what possibilities are available, what possibilities are on the verge of actualizing, so we can find a true primary point of entrance into historical reality for our positing. And then we will, of course, take those possibilities and that entrance point we see in history, and we're going to tension that. We're going to tension those possibilities in history between two poles, the pole of the universality of narrative workspace that we carry and our motivational base of attestation, which defines the motivation behind all of our intentions. And so once we kind of tension that target area within the universality of narrative and our motivational base, we can start doing the very thoughtful work of shaping a praxis positing, and that thoughtful work of shaping is called dianoia, and it means it simply just means a self-reflective, thoughtful working out of our disposition, our own disposition, in this tensioned moment between the poles of universality and motivation. And then we thoughtfully can start shaping and we can construct our own individual praxis positing of a mythos implotment. And that's considered more or less, that would be kind of corresponding to the notion of the true, because a positing is what? A positing is not in actuality. A positing is the preparation for going into actuality. It is dealing with the notion of the true, the notion of what we perceive to be the proper universality of selfhood, and what we perceive to be an authentic existential motivational intentionality out of our base of attestation. And so basically we're looking at, in the second moment, that's our praxis of an internal externality. Positing is the reality of an internal externality which functions as a filter through which we do all of our action and all of our speech act in historical reality. We filter all of our speech, we filter all of our action through a notion of truth, and that notion of truth is a mythos implotment. It's a plotted out praxis plan, individual plan. It's a plotted out mythos implotment of praxis positing, and then we get to move into actuality. So the first moment was a true internal moment, internal and subjective to our internal layers of identity. But then we're going to move not quite out of the self yet, but in the second moment we're going to move into the realm of positing, and the realm of positing is the internal externality. It is the filter that will allow us to filter what we're going to do in actuality. And then finally, the third moment, we reach actuality and the actual work of speech act and differentiation in order to actualize that mythos implotment of the notion of the true in that positing. So don't simply just jump from internal subjective to external objective history. No, you move from internal subjectivity to the notion of the true, filtering and shaping power of our mythos. And then after we define and shape that, Then we move into actuality and try to work on getting that actualized. And actualization of our praxis of muthos, Ricoeur says, creates attribution. It creates a folding back on the self of how we are recognized, how our positing is recognized. And so it becomes the unveiling of new truth that folds back on the agent self-character. It's gathered in to the areas that we need to revise, the areas that we keep open to revision all the time. We always keep disposition open. We always keep the motivational base of attestation open. And we most certainly always keep our workspace of that third virtual subject of the universality of narrative open. So we gather in the return to all three of those areas that are open to revision. And we gather in, Ricoeur says, one of four possibilities or combinations of. We might receive an affirmation of what we have posited as a returning esteem. We might find the rejection of what we posited, and then we become a victimized subject, and we receive disesteem. And it could just simply be contingency, just elements we didn't perceive that had the power they had, and that contingency could just return as an effect on what we have posited. And then fourth, it could be someone working against our intent with their intent. It is a world of competing projects, Ricoeur says, and so we're always involved in a reciprocal dialogue and reciprocal differentiation in speech acts, because we're always involved with others who are also positing their competing projects. So we could have a return of a competing project influence also. But once we reach this actualization, you can just continue and go right straight up to moment one again, because we will start the loop over again, because we're going to do that gathering in at disposition, attestation, and narrative workspace, and that gathering in creates the revision of the layers of identity of selfhood, and so the traits change, the motivational core changes just a little, the disposition just slightly changes, the phronesis of our intentional stance at the dialogue threshold changes just a little bit, and the narrative gets a little bit of revision, so even universality gets touched and revised a little bit. And of course that's going to cause us in the second loop through to create a slightly different type of a muthos, implotment. Implotment will be, hopefully, will be progressing toward a better representation of universality and the ability to actualize that universality. We have the eschatological hope that it'll always be a movement toward greater depth and greater understanding and greater ability to actualize that universality in history, to actually improve our intersubjective living together in actuality in history. So that's our hope, but we will continue through this loop. And it's, again, I'll just repeat this one last time, but it is the internal moment of the universality of selfhood as a layered character. That's internal, our internal subjective character. From there, we do not go directly into finitude and historical reality. Now, from the subjective internal layers of character, we develop a notion of the true as that implotment filter of positing, and positing is an internal externality. It's the window filter of our looking at the world through that window filter. Then we reach actuality, and actuality creates the reflexive moment of attribution, and attribution again will modify things slightly, and it'll create us another opportunity to gather in these existential influences that alter disposition, attestation, and narrative work.